Well, welcome to our second Drought Roundtable discussion. I'm Kellen Habekin with Brownfield. I'm an anchor and reporter. Last week, we talked about the impact that the drought is having on crops. Now we're going to dive into the impact on the livestock sector. And today I'm joined by Ethan Dickerson, a cattle producer from north central Kansas, Kenny Burdine, a livestock economist with the University of Kentucky, and Brad Shick with the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And Brad is a beef systems extension educator. Guys, appreciate the time and welcome in.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Ethan, I want to start with you. Tell me, how are things right now on your ranch? I know part of the Western Corn Belt and the Great Plains received quite a bit of rain recently. Give us a status update for you guys.
I'd tell you what, after the last few days, I'm feeling a lot better. Got to see some cloudy skies and some rain, something we haven't seen since probably October of last year.
Well, tell me, we've had conversations in the past with the wildfire that affected your operation, did some significant and severe damage by Paradise in the north central part of your state. From then till now, how do you assess where you're at in that recovery process and how the drought is played into that?
Well, from about April 15th to June 15th, we get about an inch of rain a week on average. You take the 50-year average, we get an inch of rain a week. So far, since April 15th, we've had an inch of rain, and that's all been within the last 3 days. So we're back 3 inches at least on that. But right now, it's starting to come back to where it looks like we could get back on track to maybe get back to average right now.
Well, we had talked, you guys had sent your cattle, the ones that had survived, to different areas across Nebraska and Kansas. Ethan, tell me, have those cattle returned to your ranch, or kind of give us some insight as to what that plan is and what's happened with that?
As of right now, nothing has returned. There's a group of cows that are in south central Nebraska, in the Franklin area and the Arapahoe area, and those will be coming back here the end of May, and hopefully we'll have some grass for them by then. And then the rest of the cows stayed down in southeast Kansas, and we found some summer grass that would normally get yearlings run on it, and they're staying down there running on some Flint Hills grass for the summer.
Ethan, last question I have, and then invite Kenny and Brad to kind of chime in on some of this. You said that you had some cattle in Arapahoe in the south central part of the state. Obviously, that was an area that got hit really hard by a wildfire at the beginning of April. So tell me, did the wildfires affect any of that part?
Well, if I was one of the cows, I would have been pretty scared. You know, the first fire episode probably scared them a little bit, but the second one, that got pretty close as well. Luckily, they were on the southeast side of Arapahoe, and the fire ended up going, the north, or they were on the southwest side, sorry, and the fire ended up going around to the east side of Arapahoe, so they avoided that. But it's a really, really scary thing, especially since the cows had been through it once, and then for them to make it through again and avoid that. I mean, I wouldn't expect a cow to make it through too.
Can you give me an update? You're combining drought right now, and granted, we're seeing how much the rain, at least in part of the Great Plains, we'll see how that's affected here in the near future. But just give me an overview of what you're seeing in the markets and right now with all of the challenges the Great Plains and the Western U.S. are facing.
Sure, there's been so many things going on, Kellen, and it's been just crazy to watch some of this occur. But I guess the first thing I would say that I've been watching closely is cow slaughter numbers, because that's kind of an indication of long-term impact, if you will. And I would begin by saying, Kellen, that we slaughtered a lot of beef cows last year. In fact, we slaughtered almost 300,000 more than we did in 2020. And thus far through 2022, we've actually been seeing about a 17% year over year increase in beef cow slaughter. So that kind of puts that in perspective. We're seeing a lot of cows move. We've kind of got the perfect storm. Obviously we've got, drought conditions in a lot of the country. I'm definitely glad to hear that Ethan got a fair amount of rain last week. That's definitely a blessing. It's great news. And Some folks did. But, it's been dry in the western half of the U.S., a good chunk of the southern plains, the west, and a portion of the northern plains for a while. So you've got the drought conditions. You've also got a bit of a frustrating calf market over the last several years. Now, this is the best calf market that we've seen right now since about 2015, and which I think is worth mentioning. On the same note, we also know that we're dealing with higher input prices and things. So it doesn't feel quite the same way that it would a few years ago. So that's kind of number two. And then the third factor that's pulling a lot of these cows to market is just that we've got a really strong cull cow market. Surprisingly so, given how many cull cows we're moving right now. So all those things combined are pulling a lot of cows to market, and I think there's no question we're going to see implications of this going forward long run. The other thing I guess I would add, sorry for the long answer here, but we've also got the impact that it's had on cattle on feed numbers, right? And you've seen a lot of things about cattle on feed numbers are high, and they are. But I also think that because of the dry conditions, because of the impact on wheat pasture, for example, back through the winter, and probably some pulling calves forward, moving calves early combined with some additional heifers on feed. I think I don't want to say artificially inflating our on feed numbers. They are high, but I guess I would say I think it's a short-term effect. And I think that, cattle supply is going to get a lot tighter as we move through 2022, in my opinion.
Brad, let me ask you this question as we get the conversation of drought and the availability of feed, and you combine that with questions about herd liquidation and where is the herd heading. From a regional perspective, how do you assess that?
Right. So like Ethan said, the lack of moisture from last fall in a lot of areas. So we're looking at that soil moisture going, is there anything that those plants can pull on to even get spring growth going? So that's been a lot of the issues we've had, East Central Nebraska, throughout much of Nebraska. We did luck out too and had some moisture come through the last couple of weeks, several inches in some places still, 80 hundredths. So it's still pretty low considering the last significant rain we've had is October. So back to what do we look for? The grass is delayed. The forages are delayed. The good thing is that it's raining someplace. That typically means that if you need to ship in feed, it's going to be there. That's the silver lining we have at this point. When we think about just how grass functions in pastures, it's looking up because we are going to get warmer. And if that rain continues to come, we'll be okay. But right now, there's a lot of people feeding a lot of extra hay, a lot of extra feed, longer than they would. Several calls about trying to dry lot cattle already, even with the rains that we've had. So there's a lot of aspects to think about that. And the price, commodities and the price of hay is still very high.
Ethan, how are you guys? We talked when I visited in February. One of the concerns was when we got to this time of year, how much of the grass that had burned off, how much new growth were you going to see? Walk us through what that's like right now, and when those cows do come home, what's the plan?
So we've talked with a few grazing specialists around in our area with Fort Hays State. They do a lot of research on this type of grass. And from what we have done on a few different studies that have happened right in our area on wildfires, they expected a 45 to 50% loss in forage production for the first year. And honestly, if we do keep getting rain, I would expect that to be less than expected. But if we don't get rain, it'll be a whole lot worse. Right now, I'd say we're sitting in there. It's greening up more than I thought it would at this point, but it's still not anywhere close to normal.
And we were talking about as well on that trip. Was it what decision were you guys going to make? Was it going to be too soon to put cattle back on that new forage or let growth happen before? But what's that decision like when you also, as we've talked about, trying to manage the high input costs for feed?
Honestly, the cattle are going to have to get fed some really expensive hay here for a while. And it's something we're just going to have to live with because we can't turn out on it until mid-season, and our stocking rates are going to be 35% less than normal at best. And that's just how it's going to have to be. But it's just going to be really tough this first year trying to figure out what the kind of the happy medium is, what we can do for hay and what we can sacrifice, and maybe stocking a little heavier. But it's going to be a tough fight kind of all summer long and into the fall even.
I want to get into the feed market and the availability in a second, but Kenny, I want to swing back to you and talk about herd liquidation. I know of stories in Nebraska where we're seeing a lot of head go into sale pavilions, whether that's in Nebraska. I've heard of reports in South Dakota. Tell me, what are you seeing in terms of herd liquidation numbers? And then where are those like cow-calf pairs? Where are they headed in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, in theory, you'd think they moved to greener pasture, right? But, that you've got to have some fairly close to make that work. And, so I say this, Kellen, with the understanding that I'm in an area that's actually been fairly blessed with a fair amount of moisture for a while. We've not dealt with the dry weather. We're still seeing some cows move, actually in our part of the country, more about, I think, prices and so forth than anything else. But, I think our best guide on that, and I almost hate to say that, but, the last time that we saw the kind of large widespread drought like this in the heart of cattle country was kind of that 11, 12, 13 time period. And we definitely saw a lot of cows move regionally. But on the same note, when you've got a really large area and you've got a lot of miles to move cattle, that can become prohibitive. So, we will see some of those migrate to greener areas, but the truth of the matter is a lot of those are also probably not going to go back on a farm somewhere. We'll also see beef cow numbers decrease if this trend continues through 2022.
Do you think that other parts of the U.S., depending on the direction of the herd liquidation and if that increases depending on the forecasts and the outlook, do you think other parts of the U.S. where, there is rain, there is moisture, there is a better feed supply of pastures and forage, do you think that those areas can handle the increased amount of cattle that may be moving in and out?
Good question. It's region by region, of course. I can talk about my area better than any. Do we have capacity to run more cows in the state? Probably. But on the same note, we have to also remember that, my part of the country and quite a bit of others, we've lost some pasture ground to row crop over the last several years. And, with row crop, with crop prices where they are now, we're certainly going to see more pressure for that. So you've got that kind of constrains it some. And again, I think distance really matters, right? I mean, especially when we think about beef cows, there is a limit to how far we can move beef cows. And if this is a widespread drought that impacts multiple states, then I think oftentimes it's difficult to find a home for those where you can actually get them moved somewhere that's economical.
Brad, when we talk about, okay, so we've talked a little bit about forage, but there's also alfalfa that comes along with this. What are you seeing when of early growth in alfalfa and maybe that supply and the market of it?
Yeah, well, the market is very strong if you're selling. It's pretty high. The one thing I've seen out even just yesterday, looking at some crowns of these alfalfa, they're really delayed. Now this is in dry land. There's not much soil moisture. There's some, and thank goodness we've gotten some of that rain. That's driving the price right now. We get a lot of production out of our first cutting typically, and that's going to be it's probably significantly reduced. It's a little delayed. There's been a lot of irrigated alfalfa that's had a couple rounds put on already in terms of running the pivots, running the sprinklers. So in that regard, that tells you how dry it is and kind of gives you a good feeler for what that dry land looks like. The good part of that is that the weed pressure will be lower. So we could potentially keep a little bit higher quality, maybe some cleaner alfalfa here coming this summer, which would be good. You're going to get more bang for your buck when it comes to that down the road.
Brad, we've talked about it. Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota saw some welcomed relief from, as you said, half inch all the way up to, I talked to a producer this week that had more than 4 inches and they were in extreme drought. From what you're saying, is that what is that? How does that affect the drought? Is it going to ease a lot of tensions? What's that difference like?
Yeah, it definitely eases it, but it's kind of temporary because as Ethan said, how far backlogged they are on the moisture. It is good, but that doesn't mean we can really think about or stop thinking about maybe destocking or changing how we're doing that, because the trajectory is still on dry. Now you look at the extended forecast, the 3-month outlook. It looks good. It looks okay, and we have to take that into consideration. And when we talk about both alfalfa and grasses, a lot of those are dependent on the spring rains. We think about trigger dates and having enough precipitation. April 15th to May 10th. What do we need to do? That May 20th to June, early June 15th. If they're still not 50 to 75% of our long-term averages, we should be probably destocking close to 40%, if we haven't got those. Now that, again, regionally, that depends on what type of grass you have, depends on how good that grass is. Has it had to been abused the last few years just to pay the loans, make payments. So that's when we really start saying that it is temporary, but we need to keep an eye on it.
Ethan, let me ask you this. You talked about the forage issue, you talked about the feed issue. What are some of the other things that your operation right now is trying to manage as you bring cattle back on from being displaced since that wildfire? But what are some of the challenges that your operation's working through in the middle of all of this?
Well, Kellen, as you were out here, you saw what the fencing situation looked like and some of the supply chain issues that we were dealing with, and that's still part of the issue. I mean, just trying to find stuff to put in the ground for fence, and we've been blessed in our area. Had a couple of crews that are doing a lot of really good work, but keeping them supplied has been pretty tough in terms of getting pipe for posts and wire and T-posts and doing that. And a lot of that stuff has come from a long ways away. I know there's been a lot of semi loads from Texas and Oklahoma trying to find enough supplies to keep on doing this. And, also going away from the fence deal, like Brad was saying on the grass, and how some of our temperature outlooks and precipitation outlooks are a little different. Here, it was 3 to 5 degrees cooler in the month of April, which put off a lot of our warm season grasses. So they're not really greening up a whole lot. So it got pushed back, and that probably helped in the long run, not having that moisture, but also we're going to be a lot later to green up. So it may help in the long run, but right now we're less green than what we would normally be, just because of that we don't have the heat units in the ground on our little blue stem and big blue stem and Indian grass.
Obviously, we've had these extreme winds throughout the Great Plains. Ethan, I'm curious, I don't know if conservation is the right word, but obviously you've got bare soils that you've been trying to protect and some of those ecosystems. Where's that stand right now?
We hold on to our hats and hope that it quits getting windy. I don't really know what you can do to stop it from being windy, but we're doing everything that we can to keep from soil from getting eroded. I know on quite a few of our fields we had to do some conservation tillage stuff to get it to quit blowing. There was a lot of fields around here that lost 2 to 3 inches of topsoil. Luckily on ours, I think maybe it averaged closer to 3/4 of an inch, but in our area, there's a lot of fields that lost a lot of topsoil.
Yeah, Brad, anything you want to add on that, maybe whether it's wildfires, or I know in parts of Nebraska, you talk about sandhills, and what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, every situation is different. I know there's a lot of people who are looking to maybe plant a cool season annual real quick, like an oats or something like that, to get something to hold. But there's a lot of ground that's already been planted in terms of the crop ground. There's also some ground that people are considering, doing that cool season annual, like oats or something of that nature, and then coming back in with millet, pearl millet, sorghum, sudan grass, because they're afraid of not having feed. So they're even foregoing having a cash crop, even with the prices that they are, because of that nature. Now that's area dependent, but I've heard a lot of the tillage happening. You looked at the ground that was actually, some of it was tilled. It wasn't blowing as bad as some of the stuff that had been left fallow or tilled last fall. So it's been a unique spring, and it kind of having to do what worked at the time as well.
Kenny, Ethan talked about some of the supply chain issues with like the rebuilding of the fence. Let's take maybe a bigger picture look at this, whether it is some of the supply chain issues we're seeing with fencing supplies. How does that play into, and what's that correlation to the higher feed costs that we're seeing from commodity markets and other factors?
It's another constraint, and it's significant. We've really been talking about supply chain issues for a while now, whether it be related to equipment, whether it be related to supplies, materials, labor related, for example. And then, of course, we combine that with high fuel prices, which have an impact on transportation costs, and that impacts things as well. So all of those things certainly impact the cost structure on these farms to an extent. And, and unfortunately, it's something that we just simply have to work through, and it absolutely impacts the bottom line. And, it's also one of those things that it's difficult to know exactly how long it's going to be a problem, right? It seems like it's been around for a while. It's certainly not gotten any better the last little bit. I think that's what makes it tough from a management perspective is, how do I navigate the uncertainty when I don't really know exactly, how far I am from that light at the end of the tunnel? And that's what a lot of folks are saying that I talk to. And then, of course, you make it even more difficult when you talk about these things. You talked about fires, for example, that Ethan had to deal with. And, for example, back in December in Kentucky, we had a series of series of tornadoes come through, excuse me. And, those things damage a lot of infrastructure, and they increase the demand for those materials, right? And that just makes those supply chain challenges even more of a problem.
Ethan, you touched, and I know when we were in February, there was a concern about trying to find just barbed wire, and the price and availability of barbed wire was a concern when we talked. I wanted to follow up on one of your previous answers about those supply chain challenges. Are you waiting for barbed wire? What's kind of the sticking point you're seeing in your rebuilding process?
We ended up getting a semi-load of barbed wire out of San Antonio, and we pay the very pretty penny for it. But we do have it now. And I guess it's better to have it than not have it, even though we had to pay probably close to double what it's worth, in my opinion.
Guys, as we kind of wrap up here, Kenny, let's start with you. Let's look long term at two facets here. First, what's long term outlook for the livestock market if the drought kind of persists or resolves? Because it's going to, as we've talked about, it's going to take some time for that drought to resolve. And then what's your expectations with the feed market and what that may look like?
Well, it's been a frustrating couple of years to be an economist in a lot of ways, because I feel like I've actually been saying this for several years, but we've had the fundamentals in the cattle market in particular have actually looked a whole lot better the last couple of years. But you think about COVID in 2020, and then, we had several challenges in 2021, feed prices, for example, basically doubled, from summer 2020, 2021. And then we've seen even more of that in 2022. And then we think about the invasion of Ukraine. All of these things have been, factors that have greatly impacted these markets. But, if you ask the question long term, the fundamentals look better. Coming into 2022, this beef cow herd was 1.5 million cows smaller than it was 3 years ago. Cow slaughter certainly points to another sizable increase during 2022. And at some point that has to catch up. Supply gets tighter and that impacts price. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't follow the grain markets as close as I do the cattle markets. But, I look at new crop grain prices that are on the board right now, and I think, okay, it is early May. We have no idea, what weather patterns are going to be during that growing season. And we've talked about difficulty getting grain in the ground. There's a ton of uncertainty and a ton of risk in these grain markets. And I guess one thing that I've told a lot of my cattle producers is, feed prices are going to be high, so manage accordingly. But to the extent that you've got forage availability, and some of us do, some of us don't, but because feed prices are high, the value of gain that we can add is pretty high, which means the value of pounds we can add via grain are also an opportunity, I think, for a lot of livestock producers.
One follow-up. As we're having this conversation, I'm thinking if I'm a cattle producer, I have all of these challenges with high input costs, the drought, but the cattle market, as we've talked about, the fundamentals are there. How much of an incentive is it for a producer to say, is it easier just to sell the herd and not worry about expenses? So I'm curious, Kenny, what you think, how you'd categorize maybe what producers are thinking in regards to that.
No question, we're seeing some of that. But you talk to most cattle producers, that's not what they want to do, right? They want to produce cattle. So I think the ones that they can, they're making decisions. They're trying to make some short-term adjustments to try and get through the challenging times. And I think a lot of them are looking down the road, 1 to 3 years, for example, and thinking that when the fundamentals catch up and these tight supplies really manifest themselves in terms of cattle prices, that they should have opportunities. So seeing some of both, but most producers want to continue to be in the cattle business.
Brad, from your perspective, forage, that conversation we had long term, we've got moisture. We don't know how long it'll stick around or how much improvement it's going to make. What are you watching, and what is your advice to producers who are trying to navigate that?
Yeah, I think the easiest decision is to make sure your pasture stays good long term for you, for your children, for generations to come. And if we abuse it too hard, that's going to be bad. Like I said, you still got to pay the bills, and you still got to keep cattle on there if you can. But if you do it several years in a row, it's those short-term decisions are going to be bad for the long term. That's when we do look at maybe selling or temporarily placing your cattle someplace else. I know some people who back in 2012, when we had bad drought here, especially in Nebraska here, a lot of people shifted to having more yearlings. Stocker yearlings on their operation, and that's their drought management strategy, or even deferring a pasture, so they have something to go to potentially, or to hay it. So those are a lot of options, and they're not easy. They're not easy options. They're not easy decisions. But if we don't get the rain and we don't have that good soil moisture built up even after this year, then we really got to start thinking about what we want to do to maintain the operation long term.
Ethan, my last question that I've got for you is your operation, where you're at, cattle's coming back. Where are you guys headed here? Rebuilding process from the drought standpoint, from a feed standpoint. I mean, you guys are almost, you told me in February, we've got to start over here. I'm curious, where are you guys at here, and where are you headed?
Well, right now we're pretty much just doing everything we can to prepare for the absolute worst possible situation. We've got most of our acres in crop ground are going to be tied up in a lot of forage production. Got almost 700 acres of oats in the ground. A lot of that's going to be double cropped back into millet or sedan if we can. We're going to keep on doing milos. That way we can do some stock grazing and then wheat pasture for the winter. Doing a lot of stuff so that way we don't have to be as hard on our pasture, like Brad was saying. And it's going to be really tough trying to get that to make ends meet with the crop prices being where they're at, because what it looks like right now is that our kind of farming and crop sector is going to take a little bit of a loss trying to keep the cattle going for the next year or two. And then trying to work in building all the fence and getting the houses and infrastructure built back. I mean, it's a full-time job for sure right now, but 3 years down the road, I see a lot more greener pastures coming.
Well, guys, those are my questions for you. Do any one of you want to add something that maybe we haven't covered?
Something I'd mentioned too, with the supply chain and what happened in 2020, we had a large reliance on distillers grains in this part of the country. And when that shut down, that changed a lot of what we think about for what we need for feed, which is actually kind of good that when we're going to drought, because we've already kind of thought of some of those alternatives again. And I guess one of the other things too is with supply chain and those fires, a lot of the irrigated crop ground have pivots on them. It's a lot of those blew over in some of those windstorms we had, and then some of them got burned up. So there's more of those issues too, and maybe Kenny can talk to those too. But those are a couple more issues we're dealing with too.
Guys, anything else?
it's something if it's okay. And it seems early to say this, but working with a lot of calf operators like I do, and it's been great to be on this roundtable and hear perspectives from parts of the country. But I hear folks in other parts of the U.S. talking about that folks are feeding hay early, which makes sense. I hear folks talk about dry weather, which is going to impact production this year. And then I also think we've got to remember that fertilizer prices are so high right now that I really do think a lot of people are probably going to spend a little bit less on fertilizer than they usually do on hay ground. So I think it's very likely that hay is in much shorter supply in a lot of areas as we think about the coming winter, which granted we're 6 months away from now or more. But I do think it's worth having in the back of our mind that hay markets are very localized because hay is expensive to transport. But I think it's the kind of year that you want to be thinking well ahead about your winter hay needs, because I think if you're scrambling to find hay come October, November, it could be ugly.
Well, guys, appreciate the time and your insights and your expertise in this conversation. Great stuff, and always a pleasure to talk with you guys. But it looks like we're out of time. So next week, we're going to be taking a look at what are resources that producers can utilize in terms of drought assistance and things like that. We'll also probably try to take a look at policy from a state level and then a national level as well as we get into discussions with the next Farm Bill. So that will be about next week's episode. But for Kenny, Brad, and Ethan, I'm Kellen Havick. You've been watching our second episode of the Drought Roundtable discussion with the 2022 drought in the Great Plains, and we appreciate you guys watching.